hello. Welcome to our discussion organized by the Garrett History Society. I am Raja, a faculty member at the Department of Archive Studies at the Institute of History at Government College, University, Lahore. My co-host is Shanaz, who is the president of the Garrett History Society and a fourth-year history major student. This discussion is a part of our series of conversations with historians. Here, the students and faculty member of the Institute of History at Government College, University, Lahore invite academics to engage in a discussion with them about their published works and ideas. We are very pleased to welcome our today's guest, Professor Dr. Iftikhar Malik, and in today's discussion, we will be talking to him about teaching and researching history. Before we begin our conversation, I would request our Vice Chancellor, Professor Dr. Asghar Zaidi, for his opening remarks.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. It is a great pleasure for me to announce that Garrett History Society has organized a panel discussion on the subject of teaching and research history. We are honored indeed to have our distinguished guest speaker, Professor Dr. Iftikhar Haider Malik, who is an emeritus professor at Bath Spa University, where he taught for more than 27 years. He has published 20 books, and I'm delighted to announce that his book on the Silk Road and Beyond, Narratives of a Muslim Historian, has recently been declared as the best book in the category of English non-fiction in the 10th UBL Literature and Arts Awards 2022. We are privileged to have him as a professor at the Institute of History and are indebted to the services that he has provided in highlighting Pakistan's voice in global academia. In this discussion, he will be offering his thoughts on historical decoloniality and challenging linear approaches in the discipline. The panelists will also explore how the space of a classroom and resources can be reimagined in new and creative ways to facilitate intellectual growth. I hope that we will all learn from this invaluable talk from the panelists and from Dr. Iftikhar Haider Malik. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. A big warm welcome to our discussion. We have Professor Iftikhar Malik with us. Thank you so much for taking out your time to join us today.
It is certainly an honor to have you here with us. I will now briefly outline his journey for our audience. Professor Iftikhar Haider Malik, a fellow of the Royal Historical Society, is a professor emeritus at Bath Spa University, where he taught history for 27 years. Earlier, during 1989 to 1994, he was a senior member at St. Anthony's College, Oxford, and since 2003 is an MCR at Wolfson College, Oxford. With doctoral and postdoctoral training at Michigan State, Columbia, and UC Berkeley, he has published 20 books and several research papers. Iftikhar's most recent volume include Curating Lived Islam in the Muslim World came out in June 2021. His book on the Silk Road and Beyond, Narratives of a Muslim Historian, has recently been declared as best book in the category of English non-fiction in the 10th UBL Literature and Arts Awards 2022 held in Karachi. His other remarkable books include Pashtun Identity and Geopolitics in Southwest Asia, Pakistan and Afghanistan since 9/11, Democracy, Pakistan, Democracy, Terror and the Building of a Nation, Crescent Between Cross and Star, Muslims and West after 9/11. Since 2001, Iftikhar has offered more than 1,000 media interviews in addition to special lectures and seminars to community groups. Iftikhar has lectured at renowned universities and think tanks across the world, and 2 months back, he joined GCU, his alma mater, as a visiting professor.
Let us take the conversation further from here. So my question is, when I came across Bell Hooks' reading on Teaching to Transgress, where she says that the classroom remains the most radical space for possibility. So how might we use this setting of a classroom to not only learn about the lessons of the past, but to use it to imagine future growth and emancipation?
First of all, thank you to both of you and to the Institute of History for giving me this opportunity to share my thoughts and my views with you. Reza asked a question about Bell Hooks' views on the class. I think first let me say a few words about Bell Hooks herself. She passed away a year ago, and she was one of the most well-known African-American intellectuals, writers, and professors. She was born in Kentucky from a very poor family background she was. Her mother, I think, was working in white people's homes, and her father was a janitor. But she was, with the encouragement from her parents, very much into books, reading. So she was a very much self-made person. She was born in 1952, exactly the time when America was opening a new chapter in its history, heading towards desegregation and followed by the civil rights movement. And you come across, eminent names like Dr. Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, W. Du Bois, and the rest. What she is saying, she has done lots of books, and she was a public intellectual, and also she was an activist. And her views about classroom, I think, were given in the context that is through education, through knowledge capital, that you could bring about transformation, not only in individual thinking or individual life, but also in the collective lives of societies, communities. And she was speaking not just as an African-American intellectual, but also as a woman. And she felt that in the 60s and 70s, feminism and the second wave feminism, they were making news. And she felt that we need to educate people on all sides, and even, white feminists, white women feminists, about the problems, the predicaments, and the challenges which are faced by non-white women, whether they lived in America or they lived in Asia or Africa. So when she talks about classroom, I think she is using classroom in a symbolic way, means education, and also means unlearning, getting rid of those biases. I think historical knowledge in that sense is greatly helpful to understand where this all, started. I mean, for example, how did we reach the present state of affairs? And I think she was talking about, for example, African-American women, that their journey from Africa and generations, going through the predicament of slavery and the breakup of family, breakup of, breakdown of cultures and the connections. All those things carry on as legacies. And as we saw in the 20th century, lots of black people were living in cities after 1920, the great migration from the south to the north, northern cities in America. And she felt that still, there were forces lined up against black people, and especially against black women. And in many cases, black women were single parents. And they were working women, and they were looking after families, and many black men were either suffering from all kinds of psychological issues and economic underdevelopment, educational underachievement, and also because of denigration by the society at large. And quite a big proportion of black men were in the jails, as they are sadly today in the United States. So what she meant was, what Booker T. Washington, the great African-American leader in the 19th century, who was the contemporary of our Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, what she was saying that we have to go to the schools. And so for the black people, and especially for black women, they should attain education. And for non-black people, white people, the rest of the community should learn about black people, their African background, their centuries of enslavement, and how they have been left behind in this so-called land of rags to riches. But we know that since 1990s, classrooms are facing a crisis. The typical classroom lecture-based instruction is no more popular. Our students, our colleagues, our research fellows can have access to all the information from the internet. And especially during the COVID, we saw that we became very much dependent on this online technology, information technology. So maybe the whole concept of classroom has changed. And maybe this is where I think we as teachers of history or other disciplines in humanities and social sciences have to make classrooms more relevant, more engaging, and more participatory, and more original for our students so that they could come back and they could be equal partners rather than being on the listening end. So I do feel that Bell Hooks, she picked up her name. Her real name was Gloria Jean Watkins, and she was born in Kentucky and she died in Kentucky. So, but she picked up the name of her great-grandmother, and that was Bill Hooks. And out of respect, she spelled Bell Hooks in small letters, out of respect for her ancestor. So she was a great mover and shaker. And I think her ideas on class, on racism, on color, on gender, on education are very, very relevant. Because when we talk about civil rights in America, we mostly end up focusing on men, especially African American men. And in the process, we forget or underestimate the role of African American women. And that is where I think Bell Hooks is very, very relevant to us. And her books, her speeches, her articles, her autobiographical writing, they bring her into our classroom as one of us.
Thank you so much for your thoughts on that. I'll just get to the gender aspect towards the end of the talk. But what I took from your comments is about how the classroom as a space is constantly evolving. There's no set definition of it. And I think what I often emphasize, at least in my teaching, is how we can translate the knowledge we attain in classroom and translate it towards application or praxis. So it kind of serves that element of transition, and how we can move beyond the space of a classroom to attain knowledge as well, but still having that as the starting point. And of course, you mentioned about the contemporary legacies of the writers we read. So we'll just follow up with the question on that.
Thank you, Professor. Our next question is, should we limit the events to the past if they have legacies in future? How might we challenge the linear flow of history through this?
Well, this has been a great debate in history. And writing history is very recent. If you compare it with entire human, career on this planet. We have been here, God knows, millions of years or so. But writing down history is very recent. And generally we end up discussing some religious scriptures, Jewish, Hindu, in the classical past. But then we start with Greek historians like Herodotus and Thucydides and then the Romans. So, but the way Herodotus wrote history, he wanted to convey not only information to the future generations, but also he wanted to transform their thinking about the past. He wanted them to stay rooted in the Greek past. But at the same time, he wanted Greek people to forego these civil wars which are happening so often, not only amongst states like Sparta and Athens and others, but also he wanted a Greek collective identity based on peace, justice. So his pioneering of historical scholarship was motivated by certain factors, and he traveled to many of these places that he wrote about. Though his main area of interest, Herodotus' main interest was wars between the ancient Persians and the ancient Greeks. But if you read his writing, he's not denigrating the Persians. He respects them for their views, their religious convictions, and also their food habits. And he's not downgrading them simply because they are the enemies. So what I'm suggesting is that our knowledge of the past, since the time when we started writing down history, is with certain purpose, that we understand the present in a more comprehensive way. The tribulations as well as the dynamics of our present, we need to have a better understanding of the legacies. For example, when we talk about nation state, I think we need to learn about the empires, how these empires came into being. And then within the study of the empires, we see that there were different kinds of empires. There were empires created by individuals like Alexander. There were empires created by religious people like the Jewish empires. And there were empires which were created in the name of religion in some cases, like caliphates and imamates, Fatimid Empire, Abbasid, Umayyad. And then there were modern empires. In Europe, the empires created by, West European powers. And they benefited from commercial revolution, industrial revolution, and they became more powerful than the empires which existed in the previous period. And that is why our empires, like the Ottomans, the Safavids, the Greeks, Mings in China, and the Uzbeks in Central Asia, and the Mali Empire in Africa lost out to these empires. To understand where most of the world is today, in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, we need to go back to that period of the empires, where we made the mistakes, where we missed the bus, where did we gain, how did we reach here? And like, for example, when we talk about the climate, how the climatic changes have brought down the boundaries, though industrial revolution happened in North Atlantic region, but now we all are paying the prices. Pakistan's contribution towards global environment is 0.1%, even less than that. But we are one of the 10 most precarious countries. So I think we need to understand the world in a macro context. And we cannot start just from today. I know there are historians who talk about presentism, that we should focus on today, but how can you divest yourself from what happened yesterday or day before yesterday? Even many contemporary living subjects like political science and international relations, they cannot ignore the past, the yesterdays in history. Philosophy, history, literature, psychology, languages, all these areas that we call liberal arts and humanities, their mainstay is on the past. But we are not saying that when we study our past, our own past, or past of any other community or nation state, we are living that period. Historians may relive that past when they're writing down about that past, but they're not really literally reliving that past. They are gaining information so that we enlighten ourselves about our past experiences and our pitfalls, so that we have a better present and a more favorable future. So even if we are very present orientated or future orientated, I think we can't do it without understanding and having a comparative perspective of the past. And that's where historical scholarship, teaching as well as research, they become very important for us.
Thank you for that as well. And I think I'll take up the portion you were mentioning about the continuity of history and how the narratives are shaped. So regarding, I think this is more an element of methodology, we often see history or its narratives relying a lot on the concept of dates. But of course, throughout communal histories and throughout historical discourse, there are other sources such as folktales or oral traditions or mythologies, which although don't follow this pattern of using dates as verifying them, but they're still very important aspects of historical themes. So should we move beyond such a quantified or numerical approach to history, which is only limited to only that which is dated is authentic? Or how can we incorporate what some historians might consider the unreal, but it is very much reality for the communities who believe in such sources?
Well, some people maybe justifiably, or maybe not justifiably, reduce historical knowledge to dates and individuals. Yes. So that's the stereotype sometimes people have about our discipline. I think history goes beyond that, because we are a mainstream of humanities, human experience, human knowledge, human narrative. That's why we historians talk about civilization. Our younger cousins, anthropologists, they talk about, I call them younger because anthropology is a new subject. Some people link it up with colonial empire, European colonial empire. But anyway, anthropology is a very respectable academic discipline, they focus on cultures. They focus on smaller communities. I mean, nobody is stopping we historians from studying smaller micro communities. But generally, historians have been focused on civilization. And I think at one level, we are part of a human civilization. At another level, we may have our own unique features, but we cannot disconnect ourselves from this global human heritage. So I think reducing history to few individuals or few years is not, doing justice to this scholarship. And I'm not defending history here because I'm a historian. But these are really the issues which came up in the 1990s when people were talking about postmodernism. Late 80s and 1990s, history faced, like other subjects in humanities, faced a strong criticism from postmodernism. And all these narratives or mega narratives were being challenged. And some people in the 1990s felt that maybe history, as we have learned or as we teach, may disappear. No, it did not. I think our subject became more interdisciplinary and a kind of intersectionality. Like here, we talk about emotions, or we bring in, sort of mystical culture, or micro histories, or urban histories. All those kind of things. We became aware of the fact that maybe we need to, focus on new areas. So I do feel that history is, but dates are important because this is where we can contextualize those individuals and those historical events which have happened in the past. But coming back to the issue of individuals, I know even in 1930s and 40s, a very famous British historian, A.G.P. Taylor, made a claim saying that entire modern history can be simplified to three individuals. And that is that is Bismarck and Lenin and Hitler. Now this is called Eurocentricity, and it is also called reductionism. And maybe he was linking it up with what Thomas Carlyle was flagging, hero in history. That you have, certain heroes in entire human history, and you should just focus on that. So I think reducing entire human heritage, known or still unknown, to few individuals or just to few years is oversimplification of a very complex subject. I mean, I taught at this university in Bath that you mentioned, and we had a very strong and well-established department of creative writings. And we had some of the top-notch novelists, poets, playwrights working with me in the same school, in the same faculty. And we used to have chats, and they would tell me that 80% of the novels they teach, read, write are historical. So history is not just facts and figures, or dates and years, or individuals. In literature, 80% novels, and it's not just English literature. They are based on, and you might have read lots of novels, and you will see that novelists do lots of research. They go around, they work in the libraries like historians, they look at the archives, they interview people, they try to live that life and then use their imagination. And the way a historian, looks at the facts and uses archives and then tries to relive that period. For example, if I'm doing history of a biography of Babur, so I would like to go to Farghana, I would like to go to Uzbekistan, I would like to have a feel of traditional Samarkand, I would like to see Afghanistan, and the way Babur traveled from one end to the other, and how he entered into Pashtun areas, and then how he came to Lahore, and then further went down to Delhi and Agra. So I would need to travel, I would need to understand the culture, I would have to understand the ecology of the places that Babur came from. And maybe I'll have to read something in Chuktai Turkish as well, and not just reading everything in English, and maybe a little bit. So this is where I think we, and historians and novelists, and also philosophers, by the way, philosophy, any kind of philosophy, European, Indian, Muslim, there's lots of history in it.
So I do feel that maybe we need to keep on having such discourses and debates where historical scholarship will be, because even in Pakistan, first people think, oh, well, history, languages, literature, philosophy, archaeology, anthropology, they are luxuries. We don't, our country doesn't need them. And number two, people think, oh, well, there are no jobs in these areas. So the result is that humanities have not been given the priority, both by the society and the state, which they deserve. And we carry on with these subjects, we carry on teaching them. But I think society is still not properly appreciative of how humanities are so vital to our understanding of our own roots and the situation we are today, and how we face problems in rural areas, urban areas, at national level, and how we are placed in a very growingly interdependent, global context. So I do feel that we need to raise these issues, and maybe we historians have not raised these issues the way we should have, and still history is defined in a very reductionist way.
I think this leads us very well into our next question, because you mentioned how history could be boiled down to three individuals and how there's a continuity of Eurocentrism and how, modern day approaches are trying to challenge that. So follow up with the question on that?
Professor, if we talk about curriculum, there are widening debates on decolonizing the curriculum in the West, but it has led to the political debate in the government. How should scholars be included in the curriculum that is going to affect our teaching?
I think since 1960s, all over the world, there has been a concern that the previous views of history or other humanities, subjects in humanities, in a very cyclic way or unilinear way are not good enough. For example, mostly we were focused on political history or military history. I mean, even British history, for example, if you look at the components of British historiography, imperial history and military history take a major section of British history. And even if you go to the British Library, the main archival place, or Bodleian Library in Oxford, where I did the research, or the local regional archives, most of the focus is on those men and some women who were part of the imperial history, imperial enterprise, or they were involved in military engagements, for example, on our frontier in Afghanistan, or in Africa, or in China, or in Europe, or in Americas. So I think 1960s, there have been a very conscious movement to expand, this historical realm. And this is where gender came in, this is where ethnic history came in, the minorities came in, this is where the study of cultures came in, and this is where I think the next wave of this counter-critique was to involve non-European, non-Western themes and scholars and histories and humanities. So this movement for decolonizing humanities is global. What it's saying is that if you're teaching philosophy, you start with the Greeks and you end with Bertrand Russell or whatever. Where are the Indian historians? Where are the African philosophers? Where are the Chinese philosophers? Where are the Central Asian writers and philosophers? While you call it world philosophy. Same way when we say world history. I mean, I know our course books, our archives, and our syllabus were largely designed after Macaulay, 1830s onward in the subcontinent. Similar kind of preening and selection and rejection took place in China, in Africa, and in Americas. So decolonizing would mean that we don't underrate what we are doing so far or what other generations have done. We bring in our indigenous sources, our indigenous evidence, our indigenous vocabularies, and we bring in, for example, this scholarship should not be West-centric. Maybe we need to understand what's going on in Latin America, what's going on in Africa, how Chinese are rewriting their history, how Central Asians are defining their past and their present, how Native Americans in North America, Canada, and United States refuse to be objectified. They want to be very much active in their own history, in their own historical knowledge. How the indigenous communities and women, for example, or transgender communities are being refused to accept this objectification. For example, I saw this program, and there was this minister from Singapore and somebody from BBC or CRC, and then asked the question, oh, China is a repressive country, and China has got one-party dictatorship and all that. And this person said, stop it, you are giving us Anglo-Saxon history. In 2019, he said 119 Chinese traveled all over the world. 119 million Chinese traveled all over the world in 2019. And not single one of them sought asylum in any country that they were traveling through. So if China was so repressive and so dictatorial, why so many, 190 million Chinese came back? And for 30 years, there has been a growth in Chinese economy, and it has become the second or third largest. So I'm not saying that China is problem-free, but what you get in Western knowledge and scholarship in the universities and in the books and then in the media is a very kind of reductionist, simplified, and often negative view. I mean, every 7 minutes, you will be surprised, every 7 minutes, this was an academic report 7 years ago, every 7 minutes there is a new book, new documentary, new video, just on Islam, just in English, every 7 minutes. And so if you include German, Russian, Arabic, Farsi, Urdu. So where are those works other than those written in English? So I mean, languages have hegemony, the way powerful countries, powerful nations have hegemony, or multinational corporations have hegemony. But it does not mean that you totally ignore, indigenous realities of those countries which you are actually studying. And that is what we mean by decolonization. So 2015, there was a movement in South Africa, in Ghana, and then in Britain, which is known as the Cecil Rhodes should come down. I mean,
Rhodes must fall.
Yeah, Rhodes must fall, because he was a racist, colonial 19th century chap who made so much money from diamonds and gold in South Africa, and the whole country was named after it, Rhodesia. Now it's called Zimbabwe. And he gave money to Oxford, where he was a student. And there's a statue in High Street on one of the buildings of his college, Oriel College. So this became a turning point. So Rhodes' sculpture was brought down in South Africa. Even there were questions about Mahatma Gandhi in Ghana. There's a statue of Mahatma Gandhi, and because Mahatma Gandhi used a kind of terminology which was prevalent in early 20th century about non-white people. Sadly, Rhodes and these racists, they called black people kafirs. So anyway, so this Rhodes Must Fall movement of 2015 became a global phenomenon. And in Oxford, the students were very active, and they wanted this statue to come down. And then all kind of things happened. And then in America, this movement, Black Lives Matter, and then women movement at the same time. So this is where emphasis has been on decolonizing. So it's a kind of movement which is not just confined to humanities and social sciences, though that is a major part of this decolonizing. But since the time of Edward Said's book, Orientalism, critical theory has evolved. And I know that in America, as we speak, many university schools are being discouraged from teaching critical theory or, anti-racism. But this is why I think we need to educate people, in a very holistic way. So decolonization of historical scholarship would mean that, all right, there are lots of very good historians in North America, in Australia, and in Britain when it comes to English. But then there are good historians writing histories of the world and histories of their own nations in Africa, in Latin America, in India, in Pakistan, in China. Why? It's our ignorance that we are not aware of them because our focus remains on North Atlantic region. Once our historical scholarship was focused on Mediterranean region, then it shifted to, with the colonial period, it shifted to North Atlantic region, which means Northern Europe, Western Europe, and North America. Now people are saying we should make it, global. It's not out of political correctness. It is simply because there are all these big gaps, in historical scholarship. So decolonizing this discipline, decolonizing humanities, would mean that we try to understand our world in a more cosmopolitan way, and not just for the sake of tokenism. Yes. There's tokenism. All right, I teach a course on world history, so most of my world history is focused on North America and Europe, but then I have 2 or 3 lectures on Asia, on Africa, and Latin America. So that tokenism is being rejected in the universities. And it is coming from Western scholars, as it is coming from scholars based in what we call South or East. And it's also coming from students. I mean, I remember a few years ago at SOAS, School of Oriental and African Studies, there was a movement which went on for a number of weeks that why do you call it world philosophy? There is no philosopher from Asia or Africa included in it. So this is a kind of movement which is taking place in seminar rooms, which is taking place in academic journals, and which is also becoming a kind of global demand. Now, how do you replace that Eurocentricity? I think that is a challenge. Are we able to produce better textbooks? Are we able to transform our classroom culture where we could produce thinking, thinking historians, practitioners of humanities who have critical analysis? Because my worry is that in countries like Pakistan, sadly, there's more focus on getting degrees and grades rather than gaining knowledge and scholarship. And number 2, my second worry is that we are too much focused on 1 or 2 textbooks, and we don't diversify our source material. We say, all right, you're reading Mughal history, or you're reading Egyptian history, or you're reading Pakistani history. These are 1 or 2 books, and you read them and prepare 5 questions. No. So I think we need our kind of decentralization and decolonization when it comes to syllabus, when it comes to our own remits. And we can't just go on blaming the Europeans, the British or the Americans. We, in our own areas, have to do lots of decentralization and lots of dehegemonization and decolonization. I mean, for example, Muslim history, at one level we say, oh, it's Muslim history, so we teach one particular kind of Muslim history without realizing that there are Muslim scholars, there are Muslim schools of thought on those very historical subjects who think differently, but then we try to regiment only one kind of Muslim history. Also within Muslim history, for example, we mostly focus on conquest. Under that caliph, we conquered this area. Under that sultan, Muslims captured Balkans, or in Spain, Muslims captured areas all the way to Poitiers in France. So I think our own historical scholarship, like other disciplines in humanities, is also confined to military history and to conquest. And we have ignored peoples, we have ignored communities, we have ignored history of ideas, we have ignored pluralities within our own societies. So decolonization to me is not just confined to Europe or America, but it allows us to look at parallels within our own experience. And I think if it enriches our scholarship, which it should, why not?
Definitely. I think since we've addressed imbalances in historical narrative and whose history is it that we're really reading, and we discussed this at the beginning of the talk, I'll draw upon Virginia Woolf's quote, which is that for most of history, Anonymous was a woman. So, keeping this quote in light, and we've often seen that public history or political history tends to have a male-centered perspective, literally his story, like HIS, his and then story. So a lot of movements are now saying, what about her story? And in light of this notion, I think I would like to ask, how can we address the gender gap in history and practice this by encouraging women's participation both in the classroom and in knowledge production?
Very good question. First, let me say a few things about Virginia Woolf, because she's one of the most preeminent writers of the modern period. Though she was born in, I think, in 1880s in Victorian England, and her upbringing was all on the pattern of typical, Victorian ethos, especially for women. Women were still not encouraged to go to the universities, and mostly well-to-do women will get home-based tutorship. Her family also had Indian connection, which many people don't know. Virginia Woolf's grandparents, I think, one of the grandparents or great-grandparents was born in Calcutta, and they were Anglo-Indians. So there was a connection with the East India Company, and, but they were well off, and they lived in a very affluent part of London. Her father was very much into scholarship, into books, into antiques. So this is where she gained this interest in historical scholarship. But she was very close to her mom. And when she was 13 years old or 12 years old, her mom died. And it shook her up. And then I think her auntie died after a very long illness. So she developed some issues, mental issues. And then her father, who was a great sport for her, who was a role model for her, passed away. And then there was some bitter experiences in her childhood, I think maybe sexually abused or whatever. So all these things made her work. I mean, they created mental issues, but they also made her work, discover herself, establish herself as a writer, as an intellectual in her own right. And then she marries this Jewish guy whose name was Woolf, and that's why she came to be known as Virginia Woolf. Now, Woolf, I mean, she writes somewhere, her autobiographical writings, her novels, she did lots of writing. She says that I married a penniless Jew. But he had a literary bent of mind. And they left their very affluent home, because it's a big family, they couldn't afford it anymore. And they moved to Bloomsbury, where the British Library is, where SOAS, UCL, and the British Museum. Now, this area in London was the center of bohemian lifestyle and center of poets and novelists. And they lived very down-to-earth life. And they would meet in cafes, and they would read poetry, and they would criticize the government, and they would, talk about these issues. So Virginia was very much part of this bohemian, what we call the Bloomsbury group. And they also, later on, they moved to Richmond, a suburb in London, and that's where they lived in a house called Hogarth. And they started a publishing house called Hogarth. And they published lots of books, and they initially published her books. Now, Virginia in 1920s, when she was in her 30s, she was already well known. She raised this issue that British history was all dominated by men, and most of the history was about men, politicians, and about conquerors, military men. So why can't we have history of women? Why can't we have history of ordinary people? Why couldn't we have history of all other kind of things which make what we call Britain or the world? So this is where she raised the issue, and she was one of those early people who raised this issue from this background. That's why I thought the background is very important. Then Virginia and her husband, I think they moved to Sussex, and they lived in a house in a town outside Brighton. It's called Lewes. In the process, sadly, she had depression, and she tried to commit suicide. And finally, in 1941 or so, she was still very young, she drowned herself in the river. So her life was very tragic. But what she wrote and what she did, despite the fact that she was not able to go to the university as such, she knew several languages, she interacted with some of the top-notch writers of the time. Hardy, Eliot, some of these famous people, Americans and the British intellectual writers at the time. So she was one of those pioneers who raised the issue of invisibility of women, or gender as we call it today, from humanities and especially from scholarship. I remember when I was a student, I got hold of a book which appeared in 1915 in America, and the book was called I'm a Woman, I'm a Jew. And, I read this book and it says that I suffer from disadvantages because I'm a woman. So maybe even not just the society, but even my male counterparts, authors, novelists, poets, scholars don't take me seriously. And then not only that, I'm a minority. And this is anti-Semitism. So I think women were already making noises. I mean, if you go back in history, I have great admiration for Gulbadan Begum. Maybe we need to do. Gulbadan Begum goes to Mecca. She was the, sister of Humayun and Babur starts her. She spent 5 years in Hijaz because there was a problem in coming back to India. And she wrote this book, Humayun Name, though she doesn't talk about Hajj. But she's a very dynamic woman. And I don't think we do any scholarship on people like Gulbadan Begum or some of those other. We know a little bit about some queens like Noor Jahan, but I think we had to wait for a good biography of Zebun Nisa, princess, who was a great scholar. And women and men have been going on Hajj for 1,500 years, but we don't have any scholarship. Very few women actually were encouraged to write about Hajj. It was Nawab of Bhopal, a woman, who was asked by the wife of a British political agent in Bhopal to write her travel account when she went for Hajj in 1860s. This was the first book by a woman in Urdu on travel. Now we're trying to discover more, but generally women were discouraged, even in our own Muslim societies, to be part of public knowledge. We know that there were Muslim scholars. We talk about dynamic women like Hazrat Khadija, we talk about Hazrat Aisha, Hazrat Zainab, and we talk about Rabia Basri. But women were always, either they were ignored or in our scholarship, they did not exist. And there is a scholar from India, Nadwi. He lives in Oxford. A few years ago, he did a research on women muhaddithin. These are the women narrators and compilers of hadiths, because all the compilers are men. And he discovered hundreds of women who remain unknown. And we were all amazed that Nadwi Sahab has been able, because he knows Arabic and Farsi and Urdu, and he was based in Oxford, and he travels to Middle East, India. He's a graduate of Darul Nadwa in Lucknow. So people were amazed that there were these women muhaddithin, women scholars. So either we did not encourage them or we made them invisible. So with the result that this gender factor is very acute when it comes to Muslim history. Now, in Urdu literature, I think Parveen Shakir is the first woman to use female gender in her ghazals. वो मर्द को मर्द कहती है, औरत को औरत कहती है. नहीं तो otherwise, even in our Urdu literature and Persian literature, lover was always a man, even if he meant to be a woman. So these taboos about keeping women invisible and only, kind of objects of beauty to be desired, but not to be open and visible. I think this is a long-term tradition. And I think we need to wrestle with it. And lots of our doctors, lady doctors, when they get married, they stop practicing because there is a social pressure for them to bring up kids and to become housewives. So I think it's not just the West where Virginia Woolf was raising these issues, or what the people were saying in the 60s and 1970s. Alice Fessler And many of these women, wrote about it. And Ms. was the first magazine, that was brought out in 1970s, that everything is Mr. or Mrs. Why can't be a woman be her own person? Ms., the magazine came out. So I think this 20th century has created these questions. And we are facing those questions in developing world, in Muslim world. I mean, I was so happy to know that there is a university, I hope it's still there, in Afghanistan, which is named after Gohar Shah, Queen Gohar Shah, who was the daughter-in-law of Amir Taimur. She opened schools and orphan houses in Herat for women. And the first university in Muslim history or in the world history was opened in Fez by Fatima al-Fahri in 846 CE. And it's called Al-Karawin. I visited it. It's full of manuscripts. And that is where Ibn Rushd and Maimonides and Ibn Khaldun taught. This university was opened by a woman. People are surprised when I tell them that Fatima al-Fahri was a scholar and a pioneer of women's scholarship. But how many of our textbooks or even, historical studies talk about these women, except for a few queens, Razia Sultana, Chand Bibi, Noor Jahan? But what about middle-class women? What about women from religious scholarship? What about women travelers? How many biographies have been written about Atiya Faizi? Everything I read about Atiya Faizi is in reference to Iqbal. While Atiya Faizi was a woman, a writer, a traveler, a confident person in her own right. So this is where I think we need to raise these issues so that our future generations have a more holistic knowledge of our societies, our communities, our histories, where 50% of our population doesn't remain invisible. This has gone on for too long. I'm sorry, we have to admit it. It has gone on for too long. I think we have to bring, and this will give confidence not only to women, but also to our societies. I mean, people ask Amartya Sen, Professor Amartya Sen, the Nobel laureate in economics. Wonderful human being. I have attended his lectures. He was the first non-white to head a college in Cambridge. And he would come to Oxford and he visited Pakistan. He was born in what he calls East Pakistan. And he saw communal riots when he was a little kid. So Amartya Sen is asked this question, how do you get rid of poverty? Well, economists will give you all kind of equation. Amartya Sen always gave one answer: educate your women. When women get educated, it doesn't mean they just should get a degree and go back to the kitchen. It means they should play active role in bringing up the future generation. They should be in the job market. They should be teaching. They should be competing, and they will gain confidence. This is how society will progress. And one reason Muslim societies are so underdeveloped, that a huge chunk of our community and society, otherwise very well-meaning, they remain ignored and invisible. Look at China, look at Japan. Forget about Europe. But next door, China, South Korea, Japan. I think the question about modernity has been resolved. I think we Muslims have not been able to be upfront about the challenges plus the prospects that modernity offers us. We are still very skeptical. We want to have all the facilities, all the technologies, all the good standard of living, but then we make it an issue as, an issue between Muslims and the West. But these issues don't appear in Japan, in South Korea, in Thailand, in China, and you could see those countries develop in that extent. So I think this is where gender becomes a more kind of global issue in the larger context of relationship between West and the East, North and the South.
With that, I thank you on behalf of the Garrett History Society at the Institute of History for your time and interest in our activity. It was a truly fruitful discussion and an absolute pleasure to have you today as our guest. and we look forward to hearing back from you in the future. Thank you to the participants and the audience for their time, and we hope you found the discussion as insightful as we did while hosting it. Goodbye, and see you next time.